Very good evening, everyone, and welcome to this joint webinar on the recent state elections, Landtagswahlen in Germany. My name is Ed Turner. I'm the acting chair of the International Association for the Study of German Politics. I'm joined by Tamara Abele, who is with the British-German Association, and together we pulled this event together at quite short notice because we thought these were going to be really interesting elections, and so they proved to be. The plan is to have quite an informal discussion. We've got two excellent speakers who I will introduce in a moment. They'll speak for maybe 5 or 10 minutes each. And then we will go into question and answer. I believe there's a question and answer function, which means you can quickly pop questions in the chat. Please don't wait for them to finish speaking. By all means, pop them in there, get to the front of the queue, and then we'll have the chance to discuss things as much as possible. We will definitely finish on time. That's one thing I can guarantee you now. And it's lovely. I see a number of old friends in the list of attendees, including people joining from across the Atlantic and from different countries. So that's really lovely. So we're joined, Jochen Müller will speak first. Jochen Müller is a leading political scientist in Germany, now based at the University of Greifswald, having previously been in Berlin, amongst other stations, a real expert on electoral politics, party politics, and also politics at the state level. So Jochen, really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. We're also joined by Michelle Auger. Michelle is the head of the London office of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, which is linked to the Social Democrats, and has had a distinguished career at the foundation, including spells in Berlin, but also abroad. So terrific to have you both with us. And Jochen, you kindly said you'd give a bit of an overview of the results as you saw them, and no doubt you'll mix that with your characteristically wise analysis. Over to you.
Thank you, Ed. And thanks for having me. So, yeah, I guess most of you are quite aware of the results in general, right? So I will give a very brief overview there. And on the one hand, we can argue that everything is likely to stay very much the same, right? It's likely that both of the state governments in Bavaria and Hesse will remain in power. But at the same time, there were quite a few changes in election results from last time to this election, and I guess they are worth to be discussed, especially since they might lead us to more general thoughts about the future of the Ampel coalition, but also it's about more general trends that are definitely relevant for the state elections next year as well, right? So to begin with these two elections in Hesse and Bavaria, to start with, the Ampel parties lost in both states. They lost 1 out of 4 voters in Hesse, and they lost 1 out of 5 voters in Bavaria. It is especially the Social Democrats in Hesse, I think, that faced the most dramatic loss, especially in parts of their heartland. If we look like back 25 years ago, it's really a dramatic shift that we also observe in other countries, but it's really in other states, but it's really a dramatic in the states of Hesse, I'd say. So the Ampel lost, that's one part of the story. The Christian Democrats, on the other hand, they won in Hesse, right, with their minister president there, and they were able to stabilize their results in Bavaria, where they lost only slightly, in a rather conservative, competitive environment, we might argue. And then there is obviously another bigger story there, with the AfD now gaining votes in a quite considerable fashion in West Germany as well, where they now stand at 18.4% in Hesse and 14.6% in Bavaria, which is really quite a remarkable result, especially given where they stood in like about 1.5 years ago. They really improved dramatically, not only the polls, as we can see now, but also in the elections. But in general, for all parties, we observe the situation at the federal level definitely determined in large parts the results of these elections as well, with the current government being not being evaluated very positively in general. We also observe that candidates do matter, right? So in Hesse in particular, the candidate for the Social Democrats has been evaluated rather badly in the polls and the surveys that surrounded this election, while her competitor was evaluated rather positively. So even though, despite the fact that the federal level mattered for the evaluation of individual parties and also for the election results, we observe some differences. And also, but we can and might go into that later, the situation in Bavaria was rather specific, with the free voters there and their top candidate being a rather polarizing and important figure during the campaign as well. So candidates did matter there as well. In general, we observe quite some polarization, in particular in Bavaria, a rather aggressive campaign, in particular against the Greens. But in general, the sound was far more aggressive there if we compare it to Hesse. At the same time, some general patterns remain the same, and that's important if we evaluate the results of individual parties. The government parties usually lose in these midterm elections, as we know from other states as well. And parties sometimes tend to vote for smaller parties, which did particularly well in Hesse, like the Sonstige received 9% of the votes. And we also observed that opposition parties were quite successful. I hope that's some of the broad overview. I'm happy to go into more details, also regional distribution within the states, but that's maybe, I'll leave it there for the moment.
Terrific. Thanks, Jochen. Really appreciated. Lots of interesting points, and useful to get a sense of the background nationally and regionally on this. And also your comment that in midterm elections, governments often lose. That's well taken, and maybe should mean we shouldn't attach too much importance to this, although dramatic results they were. Michelle, you mentioned just before the call that you'd had a very nice time in Liverpool. You would probably have had a less enjoyable time if you'd been at the election party of the Social Democrats in Munich or in Wiesbaden. Be really interested to hear your reflections on these results and what they might mean.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ed, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here tonight and identify some trends and challenges for social democracy in Germany. Maybe we can focus on the question how these results will affect the functioning of the federal government, and then later on go a little bit more deeper into analysis. There was really a drumbeat for SPD's very own issues, but this did not play out. It was social political issues with which Federal Minister Nancy Faeser in Hesse, but also the SPD candidate Florian von Brunn wanted to score points like affordable Bavaria, for a more affordable housing, better education, health system, all issues that you might think that voters would be happy about, but in the end the two state candidates were not convincing, as Jochen Müller has just outlined. The performance of the traffic light government seemed to have overshadowed the election. Many voters were disappointed by the promises made in Berlin, that these promises could not be kept. For example, most recently, 400,000 affordable flats were promised, and but only a small proportion of these were actually built. And of course, there are reasons behind of this. I'm only mentioning the Ukraine war, but people really didn't see that the government was delivering. Even though Faeser reportedly presented herself as a state politician with many years of experience, she could not shake off her role as a federal interior minister and has been on fire in recent weeks for many debates on migration. And I rely on that a little bit later. At the end, the Social Democrats suffered records low in Bavaria and Hessen, and they showed regrets. The SPD party leader Lars Klingbeil then came in front of the press and said he would like to give the citizens more orientation. And I guess we will see some of that already, and I can rely on that in a moment. What else might be possible? I guess the role of the FDP and the Green Party. The FDP, as some of you might have noticed, has thought to boost by governing and rebelling in Berlin, but it really didn't pay out for so many state elections. They I guess they would likely to become even more visible and to maybe position themselves further as a corrective in the coalition. But we do not know yet whether this is helpful. I doubt that this is helpful. It is rather showing an ample coalition that looks in fight all the time. So yeah, how will the results then actually affect the functioning of the federal government? I guess policy change is necessary on the issues of flight migration and integration. And as I said, I think we might see some of that already. Yesterday, the Federal Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, spoke out in favor of a more restrictive refugee policy. And he already earlier invited the Conservative Party, the CDU, CSU, and representatives of the federal states to a top-level meeting on migration policy tomorrow on Friday. And in addition, the government presented a bill for easier deportations and announced that it would largely lift work bans for refugees. So I guess what they're trying now is a more holistic approach towards the AfD, and maybe we can talk about that in a moment.
Terrific, thank you. Peter Barnes, the chair of the British German Association, which I should have said, by the way, is a brilliant organisation if you're based in the UK to join, does a huge amount in the space of UK German relations, organises lots of interesting events and speaker events, social events, and really for anyone who is interested in UK German relations, it's a terrific thing to join. And I believe a membership form link will be put in the chat in due course. So anyway, Peter has put in a question which I'll direct to Jochen, if I may, although Michelle touched on some of it around whether the candidate in Hessen of the SPD, the leading candidate, Nancy Faeser, was an issue because of the fact the migration topic wasn't working so well for the Social Democrats, or whether there was a bigger SPD AF shift to the AfD. Maybe if I could invite you to speculate, Jochen, first a little bit more on the AfD and what's happening here. We've got regional elections coming up in Eastern Germany. There's every reason to think the AfD will top the poll in some or all of those. We've seen the CDU wobbling on what people call the firewall of whether the AfD could be, if not part of a government, then involved in some sort of cooperation, maybe tolerating a minority government or something. And my impression, which I'd invite you to comment on, is the AfD has... it's not done much to help itself. It remains a pretty orthodox far right party. I wouldn't look to compare it to Meloni in Italy or Le Pen in France, but it's doing well in spite of that. What is going to happen? Will the firewall stand? How will the German political system respond if the AfD starts topping the poll in Eastern Länder in the coming year or two? So a few questions. I'll turn to you first, Jochen, and then to Michelle.
Yeah, thanks, Ed, and thanks, Peter Barnes. And there's another question by Matthias Dilling in the chat, which is related to that. Yeah, I mean, there were surveys, obviously, before the last elections as well, and Nancy Faeser performed far worse than candidates in previous elections in the state of Hesse. So it's really not only about the SPD, it's really the candidate herself that also was not really, that didn't poll well for various reasons. I think that at least that's what there's not too much data out there at the moment. So it will be, questions can be answered in the future, I assume, but the evaluation in general was that the fact that she took part in this campaign rather late or entered the campaign rather late was an issue. Also the way she commented on some issues and on the top candidate of the CDU, that didn't really help her to make a case. Right? And also it was unlikely that she will stay in Hesse for long if the election is lost and stuff like that. So that's something that people also have discussed in Hesse. And as Peter Barnes says, there is like a general pattern as well, right? So the SPD has lost over the last elections in other places as well. So it's the federal elections were a very specific case, also reminding us that the candidate back then mattered as well, right? So in different situations, the results could be very different. But at the same time, it's really it's hard to overstate how bad these elections were for the Social Democrats, right? In Bavaria, like also Social Democratic heartland, or towns, former left-leaning cities like Nuremberg, for instance, where they achieved their best results with less than 14%, right? So this is really a tough one. And then talking about the AfD more general, you're perfectly right. Ed, I think it's really a far-right party by now, but most voters in Hesse won't care too much, right? It's like, or some voters, it's like a very different types of voters they have. On the one hand, there are people who are really convinced by these far-right positions and also by the style and tone they are presented, right? They are essentially lost to the established parties. Then it's people disappointed by all political parties. And then there is a number of people really disappointed with their own economic situation and maybe skeptical towards the evolution of this situation in Ukraine and the relationship to Russia. So it's different issues at the same time working in favor of the AfD. And obviously also some of these campaigns and debates focused quite a bit on the AfD. So the AfD was in the center of many of the discussion without really participating in it. And you're also right about about next year, right? Because it's not really about the AfD participating in government, I think, but there are other positions within the state where with a third of the votes in parliament, they can block certain decisions, right? About the state constitutional courts, for instance, right? So there are other steps below government participation that can be really, really problematic for the future of democracy. Really serious implications of some election results there.
Thanks, Jochen. So, Michelle, you've 3 hard questions to turn to. I mean, one about Nancy Faeser as a candidate. I'm reminded of when Norbert Röttgen stood in North Rhine-Westphalia. It didn't go well for him. He was a federal minister at the time, and Angela Merkel sacked him 2 or 3 days later. Do you put this on Nancy Faeser, or do you think she's got a future as interior minister? Then a question from Matthias Dilling was about, just why this has gone so badly for the Social Democrats. And if you compare it, for example, to how the Greens did in these states, they also suffered from the effect of being in government federally, but not as much. And then, any reflections you have on what this success and the likely future success, if we're honest, of the AfD will mean, and whether your sense is that the kind of firewall will hold.
I guess, as Jochen has said, this was a midterm election, if we can say so, for Germany. So we should not focus too much on the candidates, because it doesn't really matter who would have been in the race in Hessen. The Social Democrats would have lost. This is due to the very, very extreme situation that many people find themselves in after a financial crisis in 2008, and then the pandemic, and then the energy crisis, inflation, and the war in Ukraine, which is not an excuse at all to put across for the AfD, not to be misunderstood here. So I guess what is really necessary is that we analyze the success of the AfD. And I hope this is not getting too intellectual now, but I would like to emphasize that the analysis that I'd like to present here is not the result of my own research, but there are lots of colleagues at Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Berlin who are trying to get through this. And I would like to refer to 2 strategies that have been used against the AfD so far. One we would call the exclusion strategy, and the second we would call the embrace strategy. And for 5 years now, we have known that neither the exclusion nor the embrace strategy against the rights works. And there are reasons for this, and it's empirically well proven that a part of the AfD voters are real Nazis. They have closed extreme right-wing attitudes, This can, for example, be seen in a study that FES has just released. It's called die Mitte-Studie. And another part is, Jochen has said, however, votes for the party in protest against what they call the political mainstream. So it is empirically well documented that both the leadership and the program of the party are becoming more and more extreme to the right, but it doesn't make no difference for the people who vote for them, for their voting decisions. So it is also empirically well proven that the media's constant preoccupation with the AfD gets its attention and makes it acceptable in society. But exclusion also helps it because it allows the party to style itself as like the only voice of the upright against the opinion of the opinion dictates of the liberal elites. So I guess it is everything is empirically well documented, but we do not have the right strategies. We don't have a problem with knowledge. We have a problem with strategy. Both strategies can be considered as failure. If you look at the exclusion strategy, it is not limited to party functionaries and the hardcore of supporters. People would like to get rid of all AfD voters, and they are then being politically delegitimized through discourse exclusion. Yeah, you somehow, you don't talk to them anymore, you don't take them seriously, you just ban AfD politicians from the discourse. But the fact is, I guess the problem is the AfD will not disappear. As a representation of the extreme right-wing part of the population, which is documented, it will comfortably jump the 5% hurdle that we do have, even when it is reduced to the hard core of its supporters. Then a legal ban is risky, right? It will further strengthen the party in the short term. So what about the embrace strategy? The embrace strategy tries to normalize the party by bringing it into government, but we know from other countries that these strategies often fail. On the contrary, the far-right parties then change the country, not the country, the party. Look at Sweden, look at Denmark, look at the United States. So a promising strategy must therefore accept that the AfD will remain part of the German political system for the time being, whether we like it or not. And obviously it makes a huge difference whether it is represented in parliament with 10% or with over just 20%, or even gets into government. So the goal must therefore be to have the AfD elections results, or to have the AfD's election results by bringing back the non-right-wing protests voters. That sounds really easy in the first place. Let's build a firewall, but you can only succeed through policy changes. If you don't have policy changes, then nothing will change. I guess there should be different mandates for politics or politicians on the one side, and then maybe for the civil society and the social movement on the other side. The mandate for politics could be where political stylists themselves have no alternative against the will of broad majorities. Substantial policy changes must be implemented. And Denmark, I do not like the example, me personally, but Denmark has been cited a lot of times how this maybe can be done. And then on the civil society side, I guess we should stop moralizing issues where, like, doing as that there can only be one right opinion in democracy. Democratic politics must always be discussed as a balancing of conflicting goals and interests of all what we call milieu or milieus. So there is a to-do list for politics and civil society if we would like to see a holistic approach. I hope this has not been too intellectual.
No, it's very interesting, and I'll come to Jochen in a second. But maybe just one point of follow-up from picking up on what Matthias Stilling asked about in the Q&A. Leave the AfD on one side. The SPD seems to have lost ground to the CDU, to the Greens, to the Free Voters. what's going on? Is that just dissatisfaction with the federal government, and it's the SPD's bad luck that they're leading that government?
Question to me, Ed, or to Jochen? I guess there is no threat to the Ampel at the moment, because elections will be in 2025, and there won't be any vote of no confidence in the chancellery. This is not to be expected, because all three partners in the government have too much to lose for that. And I think we must take into account that a traffic light government is not a natural model of government in Germany. This was born out of a necessity, and it is really, really difficult to govern as an umbrella with three parties that are ideologically so different. So actually, if you look at it, it's quite a success that they can manage. Even people might criticize a lot of the results, but let's face it, there is a war, and they have managed to get Germany out of the dependence on Russian gas. And it took them 1 year. I guess this is a new world record. And of course, the strategy must be to bring back the voters. Only then will the government, only then will government majorities emerge again. That will allow for a quiet and effective governance. Concerning Olaf Scholz, I guess his message constantly seems to be like, I already know, I'm just not saying. It seems to become a trademark. Not everybody finds this convincing, but maybe he should use a little bit more of the channels that are available to him in a modern media system. At the end, maybe his winning strategy would be that he will convince people after 4 years time that he can tick on the to-do list everything that he has been implementing, and people are not talking about it right now because the overall situation, if we look at the Ukraine, if you look into the Middle East, does not allow for looking into the details of a good governance.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Jochen, you may have reflections on some of this, and there was also a challenge in the chat about the Nancy Faeser bit and whether she would be expected to accept political responsibility. But I also wanted to push you a bit on the positioning of the moderate right. One thing which was observed after these elections is you had Markus Söder taking quite a hardline position, hardline conservative positions. You might say sort of tacking almost towards the AfD. And on the other hand, Boris Rhein in Hesse had reinvented himself as a fluffy centrist social democrat, Christian Democrat, and seemed to be more successful. So which strategy do you think is likely to be more promising for the CDU-CSU on a federal level? And maybe related to that, it does look like Friedrich Merz has a growing number of potential challengers when it comes to the Chancellor candidacy. So I suppose the question really is, what does this mean for the CDU-CSU and its political and personnel choices?
Yeah, thanks. So there are a few points there. First, we also have to remind ourselves that the other parties also lost, right? The FDP lost dramatically, right? And the Greens lost in a similar way. But I think for the SPD, it's dramatic because they are so far behind what they want to regard as the level of votes they deserve, given a certain structure of the society in Hesse and Bavaria, right? I think that's not really true for the Greens in the same way. So that's one part of it. And I also want to stress that Nancy Faeser really performed far worse than other social democratic candidates. Also even among SPD, the supporters, she was far less supported than the other candidates of Greens and the CDU in Hesse, right? So she really had a tough standing there. That's at least what the Politbarometer shows us. And then on the Ampel in general, right, it's a really difficult coalition to lead, as Michelle said, right? So it's a very diverse set of parties. And obviously, then that's related to possible strategies towards the AfD, because some people argue now it's about spending, right? Because many of the voters, in particular voters of the AfD, are skeptical about the economic development, right? I think it's about 80% of the AfD's current voters are skeptical about the individual economic future, right? And that's not really about the level of income. It's really about the outlook there. And I think one of the possible strategies is, however, then impossible because of the way the FDP views the whole spending policies in general. So some things are definitely blocked by the FDP there. And also talking about the success story of the Ampel, there's a recent study by the Bertelsmann Stiftung, right, and the Progressive Zentrum, together with the University of Trier, where they emphasize how good the Ampel was in terms of pledge fulfillment, right? So many of the things they wanted to achieve, they actually achieved via legislation. And also there were certain crises that were managed rather well. However, the voters do not see the coalition as successful, right? And it's partly because of this infighting that overshadows all of these success stories. And that's really important to underline. And then again, about the AfD, it's not only about the votes. What I think is even more problematic is that this Brandmauer among the electorate also is important, and we see that there's a decreasing share of voters who would never vote for the AfD, right? It was 70-80% 3, 4, 5 years ago. Now it's below 60%, right? So an increasing share of voters is not afraid of the AfD anymore. Talking about the moderate right, I think for the Christian Democrats, it's about diversity. Different strategies work in different parts of the country. And even the CSU, they need their far-right candidates and prominent figures in talk shows to show that they are able to, provide a voice for all of these very conservative voters. If it's only about the top candidate, if it's only about Söder, that's an issue for the CSU, and that's true for the CDU as well. The strategies that might work in Bavaria, in Hesse, won't work in Schleswig-Holstein, and they won't work in Hamburg, right? So you need to accept that different voices are part of these large former Volksparteien, right? Just accepting this diversity and not label it as disunity. I think that's an important issue. Right? Diversity is an important part of these parties. That's not really a strategy, but if it's about candidates and positions, it's not a problem if there are different voices within these huge parties. I hope this answers some of the questions or points that were raised.
Thanks,
if I might come in on Nancy Faeser, because I can see in the chat that people are demanding her to step down. Let's remind ourselves that this government is in an extraordinary situation. And of course, first reaction would be, well, she should step down and Olaf Scholz should get a new interior minister. Maybe some of you might remember the case of Christine Lambrecht. And it seems to be Olaf Scholz's style not to do this very quickly, but rather to show respect towards his own cabinet ministers for the work that they've done. And Nancy Faeser, regardless of her performance in Hesse, was very successful in the Brussels theater when it came to the solution of the refugee quota system in the EU. So it was Nancy Faeser who actually got that deal done, which is really a contradiction to the success she had in Hesse. So to me, sometimes this doesn't really make sense that politicians can do a very good job on the one hand, and on the other hand, people just don't see it or do not like to see it. So if to stay with the Christine Lambrecht example, if Boris Pistorius, our new defense minister, turns out to be the perfect defense minister in the end, no one will ask whether it took Olaf Scholz 1 day or 3 days to succeed Christine Lambrecht. So I guess we will see some kind of solution to this question, but not now and not in the next couple of days in face of what's going on the world stage.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Michelle, let me pick up Peter's question in the chat and then maybe broaden it. So, Peter wondered about the possibility of reform on migration policy with the current coalition. And I think I'm right in saying that Olaf Scholz essentially overruled the Greens on their opposition to the EU migration deal. I couldn't help but notice when that was discussed on a talk show, Saskia Esken, as the joint SPD leader, didn't look very happy. It didn't look like it was a social democratic position she particularly welcomed. Do you think it will be possible to forge ahead with a different approach to migration, probably with the Greens in government, who might be in a different place? And then more broadly, in terms of the functioning of this coalition, you both talked about the fact that the coalition's had a hard time. It looks disunited. I think we would all agree that the three parties together would fare better if it didn't look like there was a constant argument. But the problem is, it's what in political science we would call a prisoner's dilemma. Individual parties seem to have an incentive to defect, to do their own thing, to look at their own profile, particularly the FDP, to a lesser extent the Greens. And so the arguments just continue. And the worse, you might think, the worse the state election results of the FDP, the more they then feel like they have to be really assertive. 2 days after the election, Wolfgang Kubicki pops up and says we've got to, find a few more policies to trash. So the question first to Michelle is, can the Traffic Light Coalition find agreement on migration? And the second one is, can they find any sort of harmony, or will you just have another two years of these sort of arguments?
Yeah, that's really, I guess, the $1 million question. I can see that there is already a little bit of a policy change starting from yesterday, looking into the news, looking into the interviews that the Chancellor has been given. If you are aware of the German language, have a look into his interview that he gave in the Tagesthemen, in the first television channel ARD, where he actually spoke out in favor of more restrictive refugee policies. He has never done it like this. It's the first time that he's been doing this. Tomorrow we will see, as I said, a summit of on the top federal level meeting on migration policy, and we will see new laws for easier deportations. Now, this is in face of German tradition. This is really something new, and I guess the SPD will have to be very, very careful not to cross the line and not to go too far, so that people would blame them to lose grounds and adopt policies that have been introduced by people like Suella Braverman in the UK. So I do not think that the SPD would be successful in crossing that red line, but I do think that they have to show now that they do understand what a majority of the population in Germany is in fear of. There is an anxiety, and this goes far beyond AfD voters. And I guess the government has to take that seriously. The Green Party, of course, that will be difficult for them to accept, but parties are learning parties. Parties are not. Their programs are not written in stone. So I guess in face of current developments and in face of the conversations that they have on the ground with their voters, they might be able to become convinced that we have to have a change of policy here.
Thanks. Jochen, you follow the Greens closely as well. Be interested in your reflections on that. I do wonder sometimes whether when the Greens get overruled by Olaf Scholz, whether it's on nuclear power or migration, it might suit them, because it means that policy change happens, but the activists, can be told, well, we didn't want it to happen, but it just did. Interested in your reflections. Also, Rianne's put an interesting question in the chat about what we are to make of the growth in support in Bavaria for the free voters in the light of the Aiwanger scandal, party leader accused of anti-Semitism in his youth. What does this tell us, if anything? And if you've got any reflections as well, picking up on that kind of coalition politics point, that would also be great.
Yep. So concerning the Greens, I think it's definitely for them, any change in migration or asylum policy is definitely a huge risk given the diversity of the party base there. So it's quite obvious that there are voices in the party that would want to block any decision that goes in the direction that has been, outlined in the last days. And we also see that there is criticism within the party that they're rather quiet, because, I assume that people want to avoid the situation where the party is regarded as disunited. But at the same time, there's already obviously younger voters in particular voting for smaller parties because they don't feel that the Greens are following their, let's say, more progressive positions or more left-leaning positions. Right? Also in Hesse, we see that that Volt performed well. There's even Die Partei performing well. The Tierschutzpartei is also there. So there are some smaller parties also tackling or taking positions that were, let's say, Green positions a few years back. So that's definitely a big thing there. And for the free voters, I think that many Bavarians did not agree that or did not see a mistake made there by Aiwanger. They really followed his take on things, where he argued it's the media, it's like trying to paint a certain picture of him being far right from the beginning, and this didn't really work for those voters who were free voters last time, and for all of these conservative voters in Bavaria. So they think it's something he did in his youth, and that's about it. People should leave him alone. And it's really very much about him as an individual, because the party performed far better and improved even more in the area where he's from, like Niederbayern, right, where he also stood in the election. So it's really, it really, I think it was a polarizing issue, but if anything, it helped the free voters, I'd say, definitely. Yeah, leave it there, I guess.
Thanks, Jochen. Michelle, maybe so colleagues on the call, if you've got any other questions, reflections, comments, challenges to put in the chat, please go for it. Michelle, you're obviously in touch with Social Democrats back in Berlin. Maybe could you share a bit about how the mood feels? Obviously, it would have been difficult following these elections. Do you think people still keep the faith? Do you think people are scrabbling around for good places on lists because they think there are going to be a lot of MPs losing their seats, and that can fuel disunity? Could you maybe just say a bit about how things feel over there?
Of course, the mood has been better. It's really interesting to see that, because when I came here in 2021, I went to the first Labour Party conference in Brighton. We just had won the elections, and we were, of course, very happy. And we were asked by the colleagues from the Labour Party, how did you do it? And can you give us any tips? And please, can we have workshops? And now it seems to be the other way around. People calling me and asking me about the Labour Party conference in Liverpool. How can it be that Labour is so successful? What can we learn? So that's really interesting to see. But let's see. 2025 is a long way to go. I guess what a lot of Social Democrats start to understand is that we have to remind ourselves of our program and the campaign that Olaf Scholz implemented so successfully. In part, or a nucleus of that campaign was the respect agenda. Why? Because what we do is we start to understand that those who declare anyone who is concerned about the green transition or the social costs of climate protection, when we call them a Nazi, we obviously drive them into the arms of the AfD. And this pattern then becomes particularly toxic when a milieu, as I call it, like, you know, members of green parties, intellectuals, the famous cappuccino drinking intellectual in Berlin. This is just to make a point. If these people imagine themselves to be in the possession of the only truth, and they sort of style the political discourse into a moral choice between right and wrong. There is some sort of tribalism in this discourse, like us, the good guys, versus them, the bad guys. And this allows the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, to style itself as the only voice of those who are marginalized. Okay, so then at the end of the day, you have a lack of respect for the values and the lifestyles of other milieus. And this leads to culture wars, which then the right-wingers win at the end of the day. So if we reflect on our own program, and if we come back to what Olaf Scholz has called the respect agenda, then I guess we can be successful. And I really like to see that Keir Starmer did that in his speech in Liverpool. And a lot of the respect agenda could have been identified in his speech, because I guess it's really, really important that people feel that they are being respected, regardless of whatever kind of milieu they are living in.
Thanks, Michelle. That's a really I'll bring Jochen in a second. That's a really interesting point, and it reminds me of British debates about the handling of Brexit, actually, that Keir Starmer has been at pains not to feel like he's been sort of talking down to or criticising voters who supported Brexit, because that would not be a successful strategy. Jochen, you wanted to come in on that, and then also there's a specific question in the chat about the programme of the Free Voters in Bavaria, who I think it's fair to say are probably not well known as a political party in the United Kingdom, at least. So over to yourself.
Yeah, very briefly there, because I think this respect campaign absolutely made sense and worked. But at the same time, it's like this. In some situations, for some voters, it might appear that this is just talk in the end, right? Also, very recently, the government reduced the VAT on gas, and it's now increasing it again, right? Earlier than anticipated, right? And though this respect and, for people with lower income and other parts of society, it also has to come with some spending, I guess, for some SPD voters. That's part of it. Otherwise it's just talk, and then it's even a negative thing ultimately, right? If it's not accompanied by some type of support, and the same with housing, right? It's still a big issue, and some voters say there's not going on enough, and then it's about regulations introduced, where the Greens want to see more limits on certain types of accessories and building techniques, but related to housing, so that's where this respect has to be translated into some sort of social democratic, social welfare policies. Otherwise, it's not working, I assume, and it's not working in the next election there as well. I think that should be an issue before the election.
Thank you. Could you briefly comment on the Free Voters? How would you explain to someone from Mars what Bavaria's Free Voters were? And actually, it's a supplementary question: could they become relevant on a federal level? Do you think you will see more support for the Free Voters in other Länder? Could that be another a bit of fragmentation on the centre-right of German politics?
Yeah, I mean, the Free Voters are around for decades. But they haven't been a proper party for many years. So they are well represented at the local level. In some cases, it's just local individuals trying to improve things in their hometown. And sometimes they are more conservative, sometimes they are liberal, sometimes in some smaller towns there is no social democratic party, maybe a CDU and a free voter list. And there's a very diverse set of people running on these lists. And now they are running in state elections, Bavaria being one example. In Hesse, they only, I think, achieved 2.5% or something like that. And they are also represented in a different form in the state of Brandenburg. But these state parties are very, very different. In some cases, as is at the local level, they are more left-leaning or more liberal. That's their roots. But in some cases, they are rather conservative. They have an image of a liberal party, like a competitor to the earlier FDP. But I think in many cases, they are rather close to the CDU. And their roots, I would say, is also part of this skepticism towards political parties and the filth and corruption-like developments in local politics in Bavaria, where the CSU governed for so long, right, for 60 years, 70 years in smaller communities and counties where the free voters were, let's say, maybe even fight against some of these instances. That's very important, I think, for the Bavarian case. But now it has been very personalized over the last 5-6 years. So Bavaria is a very specific case for the free voters. But in general, it's a liberal to conservative party, depending on the area we're looking at.
Thanks very much indeed, Jochen. Michelle, looking ahead to the future, maybe there are going to be European elections in early summer next year. Those look very, very difficult for parties in the federal government at the moment. What if those go very badly? What sort of things might you expect to happen? Is there any possibility of early elections on a federal level? Happened, of course, in Spain unexpectedly after some bad regional elections. Would you expect to see, is there any possibility of personnel changes in the cabinet, for example? You mentioned some areas where there might be a renewed focus on policy, but if things went really badly in those European elections, what might happen? Of course, last time it led to the resignation of the SPD leader.
The European elections are being targeted in a much better way than in the past. In the past, politicians in Germany not really took them too seriously. If you would have had a look at the candidates list, you would have found maybe people who, would like to have a career in politics, but maybe didn't really make it in Germany. This has changed completely. If you look at what we call Spitzenkandidat of the SPD, this is Katharina Barley, which is a highly professional politician, former minister, and I'm quite positive that her campaign will be successful, especially because the analysis of what people's anxieties are and people's needs have already started long time ago. In the past, shortly before the European elections, one would come together and then have a manifesto. This has changed. I know that the SPD has been working on the European Election Party manifesto now for more than 6 months already, even though the elections are next year in June. So I expect a very, very professional campaign. We do have a very, very good candidate, and the program and the candidate, they really match. So I'm not too pessimistic about it, to be frank. And then, no, I do not expect elections. In spite of all the chaos of the Ampel traffic light coalition, the political system in Germany is quite stable. And in opposite to the UK, we know exactly when the elections are going to be in October 2025. And we will see 2 more years of the traffic light coalition, hopefully with less squabbling and better communication. And then on election day, on a Sunday in the fall of 2025, people might have the choice between Friedrich Merz and Olaf Scholz. And at the moment, I guess more people would prefer to see Olaf Scholz. but I don't have a glass bowl.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. No, interesting predictions there. I mean, Jochen, we'll need to wrap up in a second, but imagine for a moment Michelle is being over-optimistic from her point of view. Imagine the European elections don't go very well for the Social Democrats in spite of their candidate and their programme. Is there any way that this could go pop and there might be something dramatic, or will it just trundle on until September 2025 and then the traffic light coalition will be at an end?
No, it's impossible. Like, it might be situation might deteriorate, but it's impossible that there will be another type of government replacing it. Early elections are possible, but as Michelle said earlier, none of the parties, will gain in an early election at the moment. So I think it's incredibly unlikely. And I would also stress the fact that if we have federal elections and there will, be a top candidate of the CDU, it's somebody who won't be liked by everybody, right? To put it mildly. The last candidate was also not, very much supported, at least at the end of the election campaign. So yeah, it really depends on the candidate there. It might not really be that important for the European elections, but I think in federal elections, it's incredibly important who will face Olaf Scholz then.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, really interesting times, really interesting contributions. Huge thanks to Jochen and to Michelle for their reflections and some really excellent points of analysis. We'll need to wrap it up there. In the chat, you can see a reference to the membership form of the British-German Association. The International Association for the Study of German Politics has a website. It also has just an email address if you want to go on our mailing list, which I've actually, it may be possible to put it. I'll try and put that. Yeah, I'm not sure if I can put it in the chat, but it doesn't matter. So huge thanks to everyone for joining. Tamara, you wanted to take the microphone quickly and wrap things up.
Thank you very much to Ed, Jochen and Michelle. And please have a look at our website. We have a few other events coming up in the coming weeks. So we have an event with John Kampfner on the 24th of October on his new book, In Search of Berlin. We have an event on disinformation and challenges to democracy with Jessica Cecil, who is the founder of the BBC Trusted News Initiative, and with Lutz Göhner, who is a head he's a top diplomat. And also we have an event with Frank Trentmann. This is actually an in-person event in London, which will happen on the 7th of November. So yeah, please have a look at our website and join us for any events you like. And thank you very much to all of you, and have a lovely evening, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks to one and all. Goodbye.
Bye.